Do you believe there are truths hidden not by lies, but by our own inability to face them? An alien claimed to have been present in Jerusalem during Jesus' final days as a silent observer. Imagine witnessing events that shaped humanity, seeing the world's most pivotal moments without ever interfering, feeling the weight of collective fear, love, and choice, and understanding what no human scholar or historian could ever explain. What if everything you were taught about those final days was only a shadow of reality, and the real story was never meant to surface? Tonight, you will hear what was kept silent for 2,000 years. Not as legend, not as theology, but as a perception beyond human comprehension. Before we dive into the unseen, pause for a moment. Share this with someone who dares to question history. Subscribe so you don't miss the revelations that follow. And tell us in the comments where you are listening from, because this message travels faster than time itself. Every detail you are about to hear will challenge what you think you know, opening a doorway to the hidden frequency of truth. Stay with me as we step into a story that began in the streets of ancient Jerusalem and extends into the very pulse of your own awareness. What you will witness is not just history. It is the reflection of humanity's choices and the quiet warning that still resonates today. Some truths are not buried by force or guarded by walls of secrecy. They vanish because humanity looks away when they first surface. Andrew understood this only later, after realizing that what remains hidden often does so not because it is forbidden, but because it is unbearable. History is filled with moments where understanding appeared briefly, quietly, and was ignored because it demanded inner change rather than external belief. Andrew explains that societies rarely reject truth loudly. Instead, they soften it, reinterpret it, wrap it in symbols, and repeat it until its original meaning dissolves. What survives is not the truth itself, but a version that feels safe. Over time, this softened version becomes tradition, and tradition becomes unquestioned reality. The original truth fades, not erased, but unattended, like a signal no one is tuned to receive. He reflects that humanity has always been skilled at preserving information while losing meaning. Words survive, rituals survive, institutions survive, but understanding requires presence, and presence cannot be inherited. It must be experienced. When truth arrives too early, before consciousness is ready, it does not inspire, it threatens. And threatened minds instinctively protect themselves by forgetting. Andrew notes that this forgetting is rarely conscious. People do not decide to ignore truth. They simply feel discomfort, confusion, or fear, and then turn toward explanations that demand less of them. Over generations, this avoidance compounds. What was once a clear warning becomes myth. What was once instruction becomes doctrine. What was once lived becomes worshipped from a distance. The most unsettling realization Andrew shares is that nothing was stolen from humanity. It was set down gently and left behind. The truth he would soon encounter had always existed in plain sight, layered beneath familiar stories, waiting for a moment when someone would feel the same unease he felt and refuse to look away. This account does not claim revelation through authority, faith, or belief. It emerges from observation, pattern, and timing. Andrew makes clear that what follows is not meant to convince, but to surface, because the most dangerous truths are not the ones that shock, but the ones that quietly ask whether humanity is finally ready to understand what it once could not bear to see. What was once invisible now presses gently at awareness, not demanding belief, only attention, patience, and the courage to remain present when understanding begins to surface. Reckner made it clear that its silence was not indifference, nor lack of compassion. It was obligation. Long before Jerusalem, long before recorded history, observers like Reckner were bound by a principle older than any human law. When a civilization reaches a critical threshold of awareness, interference becomes corruption. Guidance can distort, Rescue can prevent learning. Silence, though painful, preserves choice. Reckner explained that humanity was never abandoned. It was respected. Intervention alters trajectories and removes responsibility. If an external force steps in at the moment of moral decision, the decision ceases to belong to those living it. Jerusalem was such a moment. Humanity was confronting its own reflection, and to intervene would have redirected blame away from itself. The observer described how difficult restraint truly was. Reckner perceived every fluctuation of fear, every surge of confusion, every moment where love could have prevailed, yet perception did not grant permission. Observation was not passive, but restrained awareness, holding steady while witnessing consequences unfold exactly as chosen. Reckner conveyed that interference had occurred on other worlds long ago. Those civilizations stagnated. Progress without consequence bred dependency. Meaning dissolved. Growth halted. From those failures emerged the law of non-intervention. No matter how painful the observation, free will had to be honored fully, even when it led to suffering. Jerusalem represented a convergence, not just of people, but of emotional momentum accumulated over generations. Fear had been rehearsed. Authority had hardened. Love appeared threatening. Reckner observed that intervening even slightly would have altered the narrative enough for humanity to externalize responsibility rather than confront itself. Silence was not neutrality. It was fidelity to truth. Reckner did not arrive to save, warn, or correct. It arrived to witness whether humanity could recognize love when it appeared without force, spectacle, or domination. The answer, though complex, became clear. Reckner told Andrew that silence shaped everything that followed because it allowed the outcome to be fully human. No alien hand to blame. No celestial manipulation to explain away choices. Only humanity facing itself through the mirror of its actions. That silence continues even now. Not because intervention is impossible, but because understanding cannot be imposed. It must emerge. And only when humanity begins to choose awareness willingly does observation give way to disclosure. Only then does silence transform from absence into invitation. Waiting patiently for consciousness to step forward without coercion or fear. Jerusalem in those days did not feel holy. It felt compressed. Streets were crowded beyond capacity, voices overlapping, bodies pressing together. Yet beneath the noise lay a strained stillness. Reckner perceived the city as a field of tension, dense with expectation and unease. People moved quickly, spoke cautiously, and watched one another with guarded eyes, as if something unseen was approaching, and everyone sensed it without naming it. The air carried conflicting currents. Devotion mingled with resentment. Hope brushed against fear. Pilgrims arrived, believing they were approaching salvation, while authorities sensed instability tightening around them. Every conversation carried an undercurrent of anticipation, not excitement, but pressure, like a breath held too long. Reckner observed that fear was not evenly distributed. It radiated outward from centers of power, amplified by rumor, suspicion, and control. Authority felt its influence weakening. The crowd felt possibility rising. Between them formed a volatile space where misunderstanding thrived. No one felt fully grounded. Everyone felt watched. The city itself reflected this imbalance. Markets buzzed while soldiers stood rigid. Temples echoed with ritual, while hearts wavered beneath practiced words. Faith had become performance for many, refuge for some, and threat to others. Love moved quietly, almost invisibly, while fear spoke loudly through law and order. What struck Reckner most was the speed of emotional contagion. A whisper became certainty. A glance became accusation. Unity fractured easily. People did not require proof, only reassurance that their fear was shared. In such conditions, truth struggled to remain intact. Jerusalem approached a threshold not marked by dates or prophecy, but by saturation. Too much unprocessed emotion, too many unspoken questions, too much dependence on external authority to define meaning. The city vibrated with unresolved tension seeking release. Recknor understood that once collective emotion reaches such density, events no longer unfold gently. Small triggers ignite disproportionate reactions. Compassion recedes. Projection dominates. The atmosphere itself begins to decide outcomes. Nothing supernatural pressed upon Jerusalem then. No omen darkened the sky, yet everything necessary for rupture was already present. The breaking point did not arrive suddenly. It had been assembling quietly, breath by breath, thought by thought, long before the final days unfolded. Recknor noted that beneath every step and prayer lay a silent question humanity was afraid to ask and unwilling to answer, yet because doing so would dissolve certainty and expose responsibility without refuge or excuse for anyone. Listening, Recknor described itself not as an explorer nor a guardian, but as a witness shaped by restraint. Observers were not individuals acting on curiosity. They were extensions of a larger continuity tasked with perceiving civilizations at moments when choice mattered more than outcome. Recknor explained that observers appear when a species reaches a crossroads invisible to itself. These are not technological thresholds, but internal ones, moments when consciousness expands enough to choose love or fear deliberately. At such points, intervention collapses meaning. Observation preserves it. Observers are trained to perceive without attachment. They register emotional fields, collective intentions, and probability flows without altering them. Their presence does not influence events directly, yet it stabilizes record and memory beyond human distortion. What is observed remains intact somewhere, even when history later fractures. Recknor emphasized that silence is not absence, it is containment. To speak prematurely is to interfere. To act is to steal agency. Humanity often imagines higher beings as saviors, but saviors prevent growth. Observers exist to ensure that evolution remains earned rather than imposed. Certain moments in history are therefore untouchable. They function as mirrors rather than lessons. Humanity must see itself clearly, without correction, without rescue. Jerusalem was such a moment. What unfolded there would define not belief systems, but internal orientation for millennia. Recknor conveyed that observers experience consequence differently. They feel weight without pain, clarity without judgment. Watching suffering does not numb them, but it binds them more tightly to non-intervention. Compassion, without restraint, becomes manipulation. Andrew understood then that Recknor was not distant by nature, but disciplined by necessity. Its role demanded patience, measured not in years, but in generations. Intervention would have simplified the story. Silence allowed complexity to mature. The unsettling truth Recknor revealed was that observation continues only until awareness emerges. When a civilization begins to question its own patterns sincerely, observers transition into disclosure, not guidance, not command, but shared memory. That transition, Recknor suggested, had quietly begun. It did not arrive as an announcement or a sign. It surfaced as discomfort, as curiosity, as an inability to accept inherited answers. The moment humanity begins to observe itself honestly, observers are no longer required to remain silent. They simply step closer, waiting to be recognized rather than believed. This shift marks the boundary where history ends and living awareness quietly begins for those willing to notice at last. Recknor did not observe Jesus as humanity later described him. There was no glow of divinity, no separation from those around him. What distinguished Jesus was not appearance, but coherence. His internal state remained stable regardless of external pressure, a condition Recknor rarely encountered in any species. Jesus moved through crowds without absorbing their fear, Where others reacted, he responded. Where emotions surged chaotically, his remained ordered, not suppressed, but integrated. Reckner perceived his heart and mind functioning in sustained alignment, producing a consistent internal harmony that influenced his surroundings without effort. This coherence was not learned through doctrine. It emerged from lived awareness cultivated over time. Jesus did not fluctuate between belief and doubt. He did not seek validation. His certainty was not intellectual, it was experiential, rooted in direct perception of connection rather than conceptual faith. Reckner noted that Jesus did not attempt to convince. He invited. His words carried resonance rather than authority. Those receptive felt calm in his presence. Those resistant felt exposed. This polarization was not intentional, but inevitable. Coherence reveals incoherence simply by existing. Importantly, Jesus never claimed separation from humanity. He demonstrated possibility. Reckner observed that he experienced the same biological limits, fatigue, hunger, and emotional sensitivity as others. What differed was his relationship to those sensations. He did not identify with them. He allowed them to pass without constructing identity around them. This internal stability created what humans later labeled miracles. Reckner saw no violation of natural law. Coherence amplifies influence. When heart and mind align, intention moves through matter with less resistance. Healing occurred not through command, but through resonance. Others briefly synchronized to his state, and their systems recalibrated. Jesus understood what Reckner recognized instantly. Humanity had forgotten its natural capacity for coherence. Fear fragmented perception. Identity hardened around belief. Love became conditional. Jesus did not come to be worshipped. He came to demonstrate remembrance. Reckner perceived a quiet urgency in him during those final days. Not fear of death, but awareness of narrowing probability. Collective readiness was insufficient. Still, Jesus did not alter his state to preserve himself. Maintaining coherence mattered more than survival. This was the paradox Reckner observed. Jesus embodied what humanity could become, while fully accepting what humanity was. That acceptance, not sacrifice, defined him. And it was this unwavering internal alignment that history would later misinterpret as divinity rather than possibility. Reckner explained that what humans later called miracles were never intended to be supernatural. They were natural phenomena arising from a coherence of heart and mind that most had long forgotten. Humanity interpreted the outcomes as extraordinary because the internal state required to produce them was exceedingly rare. When one lives in alignment, when love and awareness flow uninterrupted, subtle shifts ripple outward, affecting the world in ways that appear impossible to those observing without understanding. The healings, the multiplication of bread, the calming of storms, all were byproducts of resonance. Jesus's internal frequency created harmony with the surrounding environment. Pain and disorder are expressions of disconnection, and when he entered such fields with complete coherence, dissonance relaxed, systems recalibrated, and imbalance corrected itself. What looked miraculous was, in reality, the restoration of natural order by a being who had not forgotten how to sustain love as a state rather than a reaction. Reckner emphasized that humanity had long mistaken effect for cause. The miracles were not evidence of divine power exerted externally, but of a deep internal mastery that influenced reality. Witnesses assumed agency lay in the gesture, the word, or the object, rather than the consistent state of consciousness producing them. Misinterpretation became codified, creating legends and doctrines that obscured the method entirely. The alien observed that this misreading had consequences. Humanity, expecting intervention from outside, abandoned the inner work required to sustain coherent love themselves. Miracles became proof of superiority rather than demonstration of possibility. The focus shifted from cultivation to observation. Reverence replaced practice. Understanding was replaced by awe. And, with that shift, the original intent faded. Reckner revealed that the underlying principle remained accessible, but only to those willing to cultivate the same sustained frequency. It was not secret, only unfamiliar. Fear, judgment, and distraction suppress resonance. Only in moments of unconditioned presence, when the heart operates unblocked, do outcomes align naturally with intention. Those who experienced miracles sensed the effect without perceiving the cause. Andrew realized that the misunderstanding of miracles mirrored humanity itself. External signs were pursued instead of internal alignment. Jesus' demonstrations were warnings disguised as wonders. The world had learned to witness effect without cultivating the source. Reckner conveyed that the greatest truth of the miracles was invisible. Love as a living, measurable frequency that, once remembered, could transform individuals and the collective alike. What seemed impossible was never beyond reach. It required only coherence, practice, and awareness of the internal currents that shape all external experience. The miraculous was, and always had been, the natural expression of a human heart, fully awake. Reckner perceived the crowds not as individuals, but as an entangled field of emotion, each heartbeat and thought contributing to a dense, pulsating atmosphere. Fear, expectation, hope, and resentment intertwined, forming currents that moved invisibly but powerfully through the streets of Jerusalem. Every gesture and glance fed the energy, reinforcing patterns of tension that few within the throng could name, let alone comprehend. The aliens sensed how collective expectation shaped perception. People anticipated miracles, salvation, punishment, or spectacle. Their desires and anxieties projected outward, like ripples on water, and those ripples collided, amplifying intensity. One person's hope became another's fear. One whisper of judgment sparked a wave of suspicion. The emotional field was alive, chaotic, yet governed by subtle rules that humans rarely recognize. Reckner observed that Jesus moved through this dense energy without being absorbed by it. Where others would be overwhelmed, he remained coherent, responding without reaction. His presence altered the field slightly, not through force, but through resonance. Moments of fear softened when he passed, brief alignments of calm appearing like temporary harmonics within a vibrating storm. Some felt relief, though they could not identify its source. Others felt exposed, as if the truth of their inner states had been mirrored back. The alien noted that this field was not static. It shifted with attention and proximity. When people fixated on anger or expectation, the energy intensified. When fleeting moments of understanding or compassion appeared, the field momentarily expanded, allowing resonance to propagate further. Yet these moments were fragile, easily overridden by collective projection, and often dissipated before lasting change could take hold. Reckner sensed patterns repeating throughout history. In every mass of people confronting uncertainty, fear begets fear. Projection begets projection. Yet, within the density of the crowd, small disturbances of coherence could produce effects far beyond what an observer might assume. Jesus exemplified this principle. He was a point of alignment, a stabilizing force that existed without manipulation, showing that presence, rather than words, could influence the emotional architecture of those nearby. Andrew realized that humanity rarely recognizes the subtle power of collective emotion. The crowd's field is invisible, yet tangible. Decisions, reactions, and even historical trajectories are shaped more by the resonance of shared feeling than by doctrine, law, or spoken command. The patterns observed in Jerusalem were not unique to that place or time. They were amplified examples of something always present, always influencing, and always requiring awareness to navigate consciously. Recknor conveyed that observing the emotional field revealed as much about humanity as any written record could. The invisible currents of hope and fear, love and judgment, were the true forces shaping history. Recknor revealed that the disciples were not merely confused by external events. Their struggle was internal, invisible to those around them, yet profoundly destabilizing. Each carried a mixture of loyalty, doubt, fear, and expectation that churned beneath the surface. They were human, fragile, and untrained for the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Their inner collapse unfolded quietly, away from public scrutiny, but its effect rippled through every interaction. The alien observed that the disciples' fear was not born of danger alone. It emerged from the tension between what they saw in Jesus and what they believed about themselves. His coherence highlighted their own fragmentation. Where he acted from clarity, they hesitated. Where he radiated calm, they panicked internally. Every moment emphasized their lack of preparedness to embody the awareness he carried naturally. Confusion weighed heavily. Instructions were given, teachings explained, and yet the meaning often dissolved under the pressure of expectation. The disciples attempted to reconcile ordinary human limitations with extraordinary insight. Their hearts wanted to understand, but minds twisted the lessons into frameworks they could manage. They projected judgment, hoping to contain what they could not. Recknor sensed the subtle dissonance of projection and desire. They wanted to protect him, yet feared being implicated in his fate. They wished to follow fully, yet recoiled when the magnitude of responsibility became tangible. Each internal oscillation produced emotional turbulence, which in turn influenced their choices and interactions. Cohesion was fractured, even among those closest to him. The alien noted that this internal collapse was not permanent. Moments of insight appeared, but were brief and easily overwritten by fear. The disciples experienced glimpses of the state. Jesus embodied moments of connection, resonance, and clarity, followed by relapse into doubt and hesitation. Their instability was a mirror of the broader human tendency to recognize possibility without sustaining it. Andrew realized that the failure of the disciples to maintain internal alignment was not moral weakness, but a structural limitation of unpracticed consciousness. The unfolding events were intended to expose this gap, not punish it. Recknor emphasized that observation of this struggle was critical because it revealed the interplay between human limitation and the potential for coherence. The tension between what is lived and what is possible. The inner collapse of the disciples foreshadowed the challenges humanity faces when confronted with awakening. The alien conveyed that the same patterns appear repeatedly, in every era, whenever awareness emerges faster than preparation. Observing the disciples offered insight into the delicate balance required to maintain presence under extraordinary pressure, and the cost when that balance falters. Recknor observed the structures of authority in Jerusalem not as individuals, but as living systems sensing imbalance. The religious and political hierarchies did not act from calculated evil, though their actions appeared cruel to an outside observer. They reacted as systems do when threatened, instinctively defending continuity and control. Survival, not morality, guided their decisions, and fear shaped every move. The alien explained that these systems were tuned to maintain order, yet order had become fragile. Any anomaly, a man demonstrating coherence beyond the collective norm, disrupted equilibrium. The stability of law, ritual, and hierarchy depended on predictability. Jesus' presence introduced uncertainty, a subtle oscillation that amplified internal tension. The systems sensed it instinctively. Authority responded to perception rather than reality. Their fear was anticipatory, not reflective of direct danger. Every word, every gesture from Jesus was filtered through the lens of systemic preservation. Threats were amplified in perception because coherence challenged control. Influence appeared subversive when it was, in fact, a demonstration of possibility. The systems could not recognize the difference. Reckner noted that survival instinct manifests subtly. Decisions that seem deliberate and malevolent are often reflexive, emergent from layers of interdependence and protocol. Leaders respond to feedback loops of tension and expectation. When followers project fear, the structure reacts in amplification. When devotion intensifies, the system constrains it to maintain dominance. The response is never personal. It is procedural. Andrew sensed the irony. Those who appeared most ruthless were responding to signals they could not consciously decode. Their minds worked to preserve coherence within their domain, yet by doing so, they generated chaos externally. Each act of control, each attempt to contain influence, reinforced the very disruption they feared. Fear propagated fear. Authority replicated fragility. Reckner emphasized that this pattern is universal. Institutions, governments, and hierarchies operate similarly whenever internal integrity is threatened by emergent awareness. Survival instinct, untempered by insight, is impartial but destructive. The alien noted that observing without intervening allowed these dynamics to manifest naturally, revealing both the fragility and resilience of human systems. In Jerusalem, the convergence of coherent presence and systemic fear created a tension so dense it shaped history. What humans would later interpret as deliberate persecution was, in essence, a structural response to imbalance, a reflexive dance of survival rather than cruelty. The lesson Reckner conveyed was clear. The most dangerous force is not malice, but the unconscious self-preservation of systems that cannot recognize the awakening of consciousness within the individuals they govern. Reckner observed that there is a moment in every pivotal event when the trajectory of possibility becomes sharply defined, a point at which the choices available narrow and the consequences crystallize. For Jesus, this moment arrived quietly, imperceptible to the crowds, unrecorded by human memory, yet absolute in its clarity. It was a recognition, not of helplessness, but of inevitability. The weight of collective choice pressed upon him, and the pattern of humanity unfolded with a precision that even he, who perceived deeply, could not alter. The alien explained that Jesus sensed the convergence of fear, expectation, and inattention within the human field. Every interaction, every conversation, every glance in the marketplace, the temple, the streets, added threads to a tapestry of unfolding collapse. People continued to choose separation, judgment, and self-preservation over connection, compassion, and coherence. The instinct to dominate, to assert control, to protect ego and ideology, outweighed the instinct to align with higher awareness. This was the pattern of human history compressed into those final days in Jerusalem. Jesus' recognition was internal and silent, a contraction of perception that did not alarm, but clarified. He understood that the collective would not awaken quickly enough to forestall the collapse he had foreseen and warned about. It was not despair, for despair implies attachment to outcome. It was a precise seeing of reality. Love would not be prioritized over fear at the necessary speed to prevent the unfolding consequences. The point of no return was not absolute for all, but it defined the field of immediate influence, where action could no longer shift the system as a whole. Reckner described how this awareness shaped every subsequent step. Jesus did not accelerate events or manipulate outcomes to avoid the collapse. Instead, he entered each interaction with a heightened clarity, knowing the limits of human receptivity. His choices became anchored in principle rather than expectation. His teaching refined to convey the depth of possibility within individuals, while acknowledging the inevitability of collective resistance. The recognition of the point of no return produced a paradoxical freedom. Action was no longer about prevention, but about demonstration, about creating a living map of coherence for those who could perceive it. The alien observed that this moment is invisible in historical records. Humans interpreted his calm in the face of impending suffering as divine detachment or moral certainty. But it was instead the acute perception of timing and alignment. Jesus' awareness encompassed both the human limitation and the potential that persisted within those prepared to receive it. His coherence became a beacon, not for altering the entire system, but for illuminating what is possible when fear is set aside and alignment is maintained. Andrew sensed the gravity of what Reckner revealed. The point of no return was not the end, but a filter. It separated those who would succumb to inertia and fear from those who could sustain love as a frequency despite the collapse around them. The alien explained that understanding this moment was crucial for anyone seeking to witness or emulate the coherence Jesus embodied. It was a lesson in timing, in acceptance, and in the inescapable consequences of collective human choice. In that quiet recognition, Jesus held the full pattern of what was unfolding, neither attempting to accelerate it nor resisting it. He became the living example of coherence amidst inevitable collapse, a paradoxical presence that demonstrated the highest possibility without demanding its universal adoption. The field of humanity moved towards separation and fear, but within him, alignment remained intact, radiating outward as a silent invitation for those able to perceive it. Reckner perceived Gethsemane not as a picturesque garden, but as an energy field dense with tension, expectation, and sorrow. The olive trees, their branches trembling slightly in the night breeze, were conduits of vibration, each leaf resonating with the undercurrent of human emotion surrounding them. It was in this space, amid shadows and faint light, that the depth of Jesus' internal state became perceptible. Andrew learned that what humans interpret as fear of death was only a fraction of the reality. Jesus' anguish was profound, but not for the body. It was grief for humanity, for the disconnection and inertia that allowed suffering to persist unchecked. The alien explained that the coherence he observed in Jesus remained, yet it now flowed alongside a raw, unshielded empathy. He carried the weight of understanding, of perceiving the collective patterns of separation, fear, and judgment that had already begun to dominate the minds of those around him. Every footstep of the approaching guards, every whisper of doubt among the disciples, every rustle in the garden amplified the field of internal collapse he sensed in the human collective. It was a grief for what humanity had become, for the choices that had narrowed their capacity to perceive love. Reckner noted that the garden amplified this energy, reflecting back both the grief and the resilience contained within him. The darkness did not frighten, but clarified. Within that night, every thought, every subtle contraction of the heart, broadcast a frequency that resonated far beyond the immediate space. The human mind perceives grief in linear terms: loss, pain, suffering, but Jesus' state was multidimensional. It encompassed the present, the patterns of the past, and the latent potential of those who could awaken. The grief was a container, holding possibility while acknowledging inevitability. Andrew understood that the moment was a lesson in internal coherence under extreme pressure. Where fear might destabilize, where panic might propagate chaos, Jesus remained coherent in grief. He did not seek escape, nor did he negotiate with inevitability. Instead, he aligned fully with the experience, allowing emotion to flow without obstruction, without distortion. Every breath, every heartbeat, reverberated outward, creating a subtle template for those who could sense it. A silent guide for coherence amidst turbulence. Reckner emphasized that this scene illustrates the distinction between human expectation and internal reality. Observers focus on action, on outcomes, on the avoidance of danger. What was most profound, and largely invisible to the disciples, was the internal mastery of presence within grief. Jesus' state was an example of how deep resonance with empathy and understanding can coexist with sorrow without fragmenting the system. The garden became a threshold, not for physical confrontation, but for witnessing the endurance of coherent consciousness amidst the collapse of collective clarity. Andrew sensed the paradox. The deepest sorrow was not destructive, it was instructive. It contained the seed of insight, the invisible signal that love, when held steadily, persists even when fear dominates. Reckner conveyed that observing Gethsemane in this way reframes the story. The night was not about panic or pleading, but about embodying coherence while the field of humanity trembled around him. It was a template for enduring collapse, an illustration that presence, even in the face of inevitable separation, radiates possibility for those attuned to perceive it. In the stillness of the garden, Jesus' grief and coherence intertwined. It was an emotional and energetic paradox, a living demonstration that sorrow, fully embraced, does not fracture, but rather deepens the resonance of love. This was the dimension Reckner observed, the truth largely invisible to human eyes, yet foundational to understanding the final days. Reckner revealed that the suffering commonly associated with Jesus was not a product of physical torment alone. The world had long misread the nature of his agony. It was neither dramatized nor ritualized in the way human observers later recorded. Instead, it was the acute perception of collective spiritual failure, a resonance of humanity's choices vibrating through his consciousness. Every betrayal, every misjudgment, every act of disconnection and cruelty registered within him as a subtle but cumulative weight. Andrew realized that the human mind interprets pain primarily as bodily or emotional. In Jesus' case, the agony transcended these categories. It was a multidimensional perception, an awareness of patterns that extended beyond the immediate environment. Reckner explained that each individual in Jerusalem contributed to the field, knowingly or unknowingly, and the aggregate of choices produced a frequency of fear, separation, and misunderstanding. The suffering he experienced was the natural response of a being fully attuned to this field. The alien described how Jesus' perception amplified the internal collapse of those around him. Each glance, each conversation, each hesitation among the disciples became part of a larger energetic tapestry. He did not merely observe human weakness. He felt it in depth, as if each act of betrayal or indifference subtly chipped away at the coherence of the collective. The agony was proportional, a measure of how far human consciousness had deviated from its capacity for love and understanding. Andrew sensed the enormity of this burden. It was not merely moral or ethical, it was structural. Humanity was failing to align with the higher frequency of connection that sustains the continuity of awareness, and Jesus experienced this misalignment as direct resonance. Reckner emphasized that this suffering was not inflicted externally. It emerged spontaneously from the relationship between an exceptionally coherent consciousness and the field of human choices surrounding it. Physical pain, mockery, and humiliation were secondary, amplifying but not defining the core experience. The alien explained that what is rarely understood is the intentional restraint Jesus maintained. He did not collapse under the weight of perception. He allowed himself to experience grief and disillusionment without judgment, holding coherence even as the collective faltered. This was the paradox that human observers could not perceive. Suffering existed, yet it did not destroy him internally. It became a conduit, a living example of endurance, an illustration of how one can remain aligned while bearing witness to systemic failure. Andrew reflected on the layers of meaning. Humanity misread the suffering because it was externalized into narrative, morality, and martyrdom, removing the vibrational reality at its core. Reckner highlighted that the true lesson was not about endurance of physical pain, but about the ability to maintain internal coherence, love, and presence while experiencing the collective consequences of misalignment. It was an energetic demonstration, invisible to most, yet palpable to those attuned to resonance. In witnessing this, Andrew began to comprehend a dimension of human collapse that is rarely acknowledged. The agony was a mirror, reflecting humanity's distance from coherence and love. It was both a warning and a blueprint, an experiential template for those able to perceive the subtle forces that govern internal and collective consciousness. The suffering, misunderstood for millennia, held the silent instruction to endure, to remain aligned, and to recognize the true cost of disconnecting from the frequency of love. The night air hung heavy over the narrow streets of Jerusalem, shadows stretching long under the dim glow of oil lamps. Andrew sensed the tension before the first footsteps even approached. There was a rhythm in the movement of the soldiers, an expectation in the air. And yet, amidst the chaos, Jesus moved with a calm that defied circumstance. He allowed the inevitability of capture to unfold without resistance, not out of fear, but from an unshakable clarity that action in defiance would only distort the message he carried. Every step of the soldiers, every whisper and rustle of anticipation among the few who followed, added to the dense energy that clung to the alleyways. If Jesus had chosen to resist, even slightly, the resonance of the moment would have shifted. The energy field would have amplified fear, aggression, and reactive impulses, contaminating the demonstration of internal coherence he embodied. Andrew felt that the surrender was not weakness, but deliberate preservation of integrity, a conscious alignment with the principle that true influence flows from presence rather than force. He noticed the subtle reactions of the disciples, some frozen, some trembling, their confusion mirrored in the flickering lantern light. Even in this human turmoil, Jesus maintained a steady vibration, each heartbeat and breath radiating calm, creating an invisible ripple that threaded through the tension around him. There was a template here, silent but powerful, showing that yielding externally can preserve internal authority. It was an act of strategic intention, a demonstration of mastery over impulses that usually drive reaction. The crowd and soldiers sensed something unusual, but could not define it. Resistance would have entangled him in the human need for control, and the clarity of the sequence would have fractured. By allowing the arrest to happen, every subsequent moment retained its purpose, every choice made by others resonated without interference, and the path toward the unfolding events remained coherent. Andrew realized the lesson extended far beyond that night. The demonstration was not about physical power, but about sustaining principle under pressure, observing without corruption, and allowing consequence to reveal truth. Even as hands reached for him, even as the outer world attempted to impose constraint, Jesus' inner state remained intact. Andrew understood the paradox. Surrender externally does not equate to loss. It can become the vessel of the deepest strength. That night, the arrest became a living illustration of how alignment, presence, and deliberate restraint create resonance that transcends circumstance. It was a template of influence invisible to the untrained eye, a silent testament to the power of coherence amidst collapse and the enduring capacity of love to hold even when the world around it seeks to unbalance everything. The hall where the trial took place was dimly lit, yet charged with an energy that seemed to press against the walls. Andrew observed the room not as a collection of people, but as a complex resonance of collective thought, fear, and expectation. Every voice, every motion, every glance contributed to a pattern that extended far beyond the physical space. The trial was not merely a legal proceeding, it was an energetic reflection, a mirror revealing the unresolved anxieties of an entire culture. Andrew sensed the weight of projection. Accusations, questions, and judgments were not only directed at Jesus, they were projections of the collective human struggle with fear, guilt, and disconnection. The authorities, the priests, the scribes, each carried their personal histories of judgment and insecurity, but these individual energies coalesced into a single, amplified field. The trial became a stage where humanity's inability to face its own shadow was dramatized, and Jesus stood as the lens through which these forces converged and were magnified. It was not the content of the questions that mattered, nor the outcome of the deliberations. What mattered was the energetic exchange, the visible manifestation of inner turbulence. Andrew could perceive that each objection, each demand, each accusation was rooted less in objective concern and more in a need to externalize fear. Humanity rarely confronts itself directly. It projects, blames, and punishes in the illusion that separation can resolve internal tension. The trial was a living demonstration of this phenomenon, a collective act of displacement that unfolded with precision and inevitability. Jesus remained untouched by the projection in a way that seemed impossible. While the voices rose and the accusations grew sharper, his internal coherence did not falter. Andrew noticed that the silence within him was deliberate, a counterpoint to the storm around him. The trial was a test, not of law, nor of justice, but of the capacity to maintain alignment amid collective distortion. Every human attempt to control, dominate, or condemn carried an invisible signature, and Jesus absorbed none of it, observing the patterns rather than reacting to them. Andrew realized the magnitude of the lesson. The trial demonstrated that the collapse of collective consciousness is rarely violent in intention, but profoundly destabilizing in impact. The fear that drove accusation, the guilt that demanded retribution, the need to externalize responsibility, all of these created a field that threatened coherence. Yet through Jesus' presence, a template of alignment persisted. The proceedings were a mirror, showing that humanity's greatest struggles are internal, manifesting outwardly in structures, hierarchies, and conflicts. Even centuries later, the energy of that night remained encoded in human perception, often misinterpreted as injustice or divine punishment. Andrew sensed that the true revelation lay in understanding the trial as a reflection of internal states rather than external events. The collective projection had defined the moment, yet Jesus' unbroken presence demonstrated that it is possible to remain intact, even when the entirety of human expectation, fear, and guilt converges to challenge coherence. It was a lesson in the subtle power of observation, endurance, and the silent authority that emerges when one refuses to be consumed by the projections of the collective. The crown of thorns pressed lightly against the scalp, yet the sensation carried significance far beyond physical discomfort. Andrew perceived the scene not merely as an act of cruelty, but as a living symbol, a representation of a deeper dynamic at play. The soldiers, the crowd, the whispered anticipation of observers, all were acting unconsciously, projecting their fear of power that could not be contained, of sovereignty that could not be controlled. The thorned crown was not just an instrument of mockery. It was a reflection of humanity's unease when confronted with true inner authority. Andrew sensed that those present were unaware of what they enacted. Their fear of disruption, of destabilization, and of a model of coherence that could not be manipulated compelled them to impose a physical mark. Each thorn embedded a resonance of resistance, a vibration of collective discomfort with presence and alignment. The act was not about punishment, but projection, the outer manifestation of the inner terror of being confronted with a being whose internal sovereignty transcended human limitations. Jesus received the crown without flinching, not because he was numb to suffering, but because he understood the dynamics that had brought it into form. The discomfort was external, and yet the energetic signature it carried was a mirror of the collective. Andrew noticed that the crown did not diminish Jesus' coherence. It accentuated it. Every thorn, every sharp edge, was absorbed without distortion, maintaining an unbroken field of presence that radiated even as it was tested. What others intended as humiliation became, through him, a lesson in the invisible mechanics of projection and fear. It was a moment in which power and vulnerability intertwined. Andrew understood that human systems often attempt to dominate through what they perceive as weakness in others, yet the true paradox lay in recognizing that imposed limitations could never touch the integrity of internal alignment. The crown of thorns, though physically real, was energetically impotent against a being who had mastered coherence. Its meaning was shaped entirely by interpretation, a symbol whose destructive intent could be nullified by understanding and presence. Andrew reflected on the broader implication. Humanity often projects judgment, control, and fear onto what it cannot influence, seeking to impose limitation where none truly exists. The crown of thorns exemplified this tendency, a collective act revealing more about the fear within the observers than about the one upon whom it was placed. Jesus' response transformed the act into a demonstration of inner authority unshakable by outer circumstance, a template for enduring presence amid the projections and insecurities of others. The scene held a quiet resonance that extended beyond that night, beyond Jerusalem, beyond recorded history. Andrew sensed that the symbolism of the crown was misinterpreted by those who would recount it. Their focus on mockery, obscuring the profound lesson in sovereignty, projection, and the capacity to maintain coherence when confronted by collective fear. It was a reminder that true authority is invisible, unassailable by outer forces, and that what humanity fears most is often the reflection of its own internal deficiency. In that moment, the crown became not a tool of humiliation, but a mirror of consciousness, an energetic lesson encoded in the unfolding of history. The streets of Jerusalem were heavy with anticipation as the procession moved slowly toward the hill. Andrew could feel the density of collective will pressing upon every step, every movement, every whispered judgment. The crucifixion, as history would record it, was not a preordained decree of divine necessity. It was the manifestation of choices made across generations, of decisions rooted in fear, judgment, and an inability to embrace love when it mattered most. The inevitability lay not in fate, but in the accumulation of human patterns. Andrew observed the crowd, each face reflecting a mix of curiosity, anger, and unease. The authorities, convinced of necessity, acted out of survival instincts, seeking to maintain order in a world they could no longer fully comprehend. Their actions were fueled not by malevolence but by the inertia of collective behavior, the compounded effect of generations of separation from the principle of inner coherence. Every step toward the crucifixion amplified the resonance of fear and disconnection, embedding the event in the energetic fabric of humanity. Jesus moved with deliberate clarity, each breath and movement aligned with a field of coherence that Andrew could barely comprehend. There was no resignation, only understanding. The unfolding of this moment was a consequence of human choice, a reflection of a system and a culture that had repeatedly chosen control over compassion, judgment over understanding, and fear over love. Andrew realized that the crucifixion was not a punishment imposed from above. It was a mirror reflecting the trajectory humanity had taken when it abandoned its capacity for conscious love. The hill itself carried the weight of collective energy, every stone a silent witness to the invisible currents of thought, fear, and projection that had guided the event into motion. Andrew perceived the resonance of millions of unexamined choices, decisions that compounded across time to bring this singular moment into form. The physical act of crucifixion was an endpoint only in the external sense. Energetically, it represented a continuation of patterns that humans had unconsciously maintained for millennia. Even as the nails were prepared, as the weight of wood and body intersected with gravity and pain, the deeper truth remained hidden from the observers themselves. The crucifixion was not divinely mandated, yet it became a pivot through which collective awareness might later awaken. Andrew sensed that the tragedy carried encoded lessons. The inevitability of consequence when love is neglected, the fragile power of projection and fear, and the subtle template of coherence that persists even when the world chooses destruction. Jesus' inner state remained untouched by external imposition, a living demonstration that integrity and presence are independent of circumstance. The crucifixion occurred not because it had to, but because humanity had repeatedly opted for separation, for fear, for judgment over the continuity of conscious love. The event became a mirror of the cost of collective choice, an unfolding revelation that would echo through history as both warning and guide, a testament to the invisible mechanisms that govern the destiny of those who walk without understanding the frequencies they emit and the patterns they perpetuate. The air on the hill was heavy, yet beneath it lay a current imperceptible to most. Andrew sensed layers of meaning encoded in every movement, every expression, every sound. The cross, the nails, the suffering, these were not merely symbols of sacrifice. They were a medium through which an entirely different message was transmitted, a frequency that could only be perceived by those willing to look beyond the physical and hear through the field of consciousness itself. Jesus' final words, long interpreted as expressions of pain, lament, or surrender, carried precise instruction. Each phrase resonated with a pattern of alignment, a template of coherence for those attuned to the subtleties of love and presence. Andrew realized that what had been taught as a story of external redemption was in truth an active demonstration of inner mastery. The energy of the cross, the weight of gravity, the pull of pain, all served to broadcast a message about sustaining integrity amidst collapse. He spoke in ways that were subtle yet expansive, his voice reaching beyond the ears, touching the minds and hearts of those open to perceiving the resonance of truth. When he said words translated as forgiveness, it was a blueprint. It was not merely forgiving enemies in a conventional sense, but dissolving the internal blockages that prevent humans from accessing unconditional love. Each utterance was a mechanism to recalibrate perception, a guide to maintaining coherence when the external environment appeared chaotic and threatening. Andrew noticed that the crowd, the soldiers, and the authorities reacted not to the instruction but to their interpretations, filtered through fear, confusion, and projection. They could hear only the literal pain, the surface suffering, and so they missed the deeper transmission entirely. Yet the energy of the moment did not vanish. It imprinted upon the collective field. Like ripples in water, the vibration extended beyond the immediate observers, lingering in ways that could awaken understanding long after the event concluded. The language of the cross was multidimensional, combining emotion, intention, and alignment into a signal that bypassed conventional cognition. Andrew discerned that the so-called cries of despair were in fact coded communications about sustaining presence, about activating awareness amidst judgment, about holding connection to the source of love even when the external world collapses around one. It was teaching by embodiment rather than by argument, a direct transmission of how to operate when the collective is unanchored. Jesus' final moments were not about pleading with an external power, nor about appeasing a cosmic system. They were about demonstrating the mechanics of inner sovereignty under extreme stress. The cross was a living lesson in coherence, forgiveness, and the maintenance of love as a frequency. Andrew understood that the crucifixion, stripped of myth and misinterpretation, revealed an actionable template. It was an instruction manual for consciousness encoded in human form, waiting for those sensitive enough to perceive the signal amidst the projections, judgments, and fear of a world unprepared to witness it. Even centuries later, the vibration lingered, subtle yet persistent, a silent guide embedded within history. The words, the posture, the breath of Jesus on the cross were not cries of sacrifice, but a precise transmission, a roadmap for anyone willing to decode the resonance of love operating in its purest, most unassailable form. Andrew felt the gravity of understanding. The crucifixion had never been about death. It had always been about awakening the observer to the mechanics of living aligned amidst the chaos of human choice. The city seemed to exhale, yet it was not a relief. It was a pause weighted with absence. Andrew sensed an emptiness that was not physical, not even audible, but palpable in the resonance of thought and intention. It was as though the emotional and spiritual currents of Jerusalem had been severed. The intricate web of fear, expectation, and projection suddenly disrupted. Streets, once thrumming with anticipation, gossip, and agitation, now hummed with a void that pressed upon the senses. The energy of the population did not disappear entirely, but it fragmented. Andrew perceived pockets of inertia, moments where disbelief, confusion, and sorrow coalesced into a quiet tension that neither moved nor resolved. It was a silence born not from comprehension, but from shock at a reality too vast to process. The collective had reached the threshold of its perception, and the mechanisms of projection, judgment, and expectation had no immediate outlet. The result was a vacuum, an absence that vibrated with potential, waiting to be acknowledged or filled with the next pattern of choice. In this silence, the influence of Jesus's final transmission persisted. Andrew felt the faint echo of coherence stretching outward, a subtle pulse threading through the empty spaces of thought and feeling. Yet the city could not receive it fully. The energy of presence, love, and instruction had been broadcast, but humanity, unprepared and enmeshed in habitual projection, could register only fragments. What remained was an energetic residue, a field containing the seed of understanding that could grow only when observers became aware, attentive, and sensitive to the subtleties beyond immediate fear. The authorities, the priests, the crowd, even those who had been closest to Jesus, carried their routines and judgments as if nothing had shifted. Yet the energetic substrate beneath their actions had irrevocably changed. Every thought, every conversation, every gesture now resonated against an invisible backdrop of absence, a hollow space where the unspoken consequences of human choice lingered. Andrew could sense that for the first time, the collective psyche had experienced a moment of destabilization, a pause where habitual patterns were exposed, yet unresolved. The silence was not merely emptiness, it was a threshold. Within it lay the possibility for awakening, for recognition, for realignment. It was a moment where perception could expand, where observers might glimpse the mechanics of influence, projection, and coherence. Yet most could not, retreating instinctively into familiar stories, rituals, and interpretations. Only a few, sensitive and perceptive, could feel the weight of what had been transmitted, the echo of alignment, and the potential for a new resonance to emerge. Andrew realized that this vacuum was a reflection of both human limitation and the subtle persistence of instruction. The energetic silence over Jerusalem was not passive. It was a signal, a warning, and a gift all at once. It revealed the fragility of collective awareness, the power of projection, and the invisible imprint of a being who had walked fully aligned, leaving behind a pattern that would ripple through time, waiting for those capable of perceiving and responding. The city appeared still, yet beneath the stillness, the pulse of possibility thrummed quietly, hidden from all but the most attuned observers. The air over the hill was heavy, yet beneath it lay a current of subtle transformation, imperceptible to those who sought only the material. Andrew observed that what later would be called resurrection was not an event of bodies defying nature, nor a spectacle intended to inspire awe or devotion. It was a shift in the resonance of consciousness, a recalibration of presence that transcended the limitations of physical form. Those who clung to doctrine and ritual could not perceive it. Only the observers attuned to subtle vibrations could detect the contours of what had truly occurred. The transformation was not immediate, nor was it external. It began in a field of coherence emanating from Jesus, a frequency of alignment maintained through decades of practice and integrity. Andrew sensed the pattern as a pulse radiating outward, a harmonization of energy that did not erase pain or grief, but recalibrated the structure of perception itself. It was a teaching, encoded in resonance rather than words, an instruction on maintaining presence when the collective reality collapses under fear and projection. The body, the tomb, the stone, all were secondary carriers of a deeper transmission that occurred entirely within consciousness. Andrew noted that the disciples experienced fragments of the transmission in ways they could not articulate. Moments of insight, sudden recognition, and bursts of courage were scattered through their awareness, interpreted later as miracles or sightings. The real event was an energetic template, a demonstration of coherence and continuity that could not be disrupted by external circumstance, by fear, or by the human obsession with control. It was a calibration, a teaching for anyone able to perceive beyond literal appearances, a guide for sustaining integrity in a fractured world. The city itself remained unaware, its collective psyche absorbed in interpretation, fear, and ritual. Yet beneath the chaos, subtle shifts occurred. Frequencies of presence rippled outward, influencing thought, choice, and perception in ways that would unfold over decades, centuries, and millennia. Andrew felt that the resurrection was less about defying death and more about revealing the mechanics of alignment, the possibility of maintaining coherence and love when everything external demanded collapse, when every pattern of society seemed to conspire toward fragmentation. This was not a story of triumph over mortality, but a template for transcending habitual human limitation. Andrew realized that resurrection was a signal embedded within history, a silent instruction on the maintenance of consciousness beyond immediate perception, beyond fear, beyond projection. It was a demonstration that the patterns of love, coherence, and integrity could persist even when the collective rejected them. What was remembered as resurrection was only the physical shadow of a profound transmission, a shift in the architecture of awareness designed to endure in the field of consciousness, waiting for those capable of tuning into its hidden frequency. In the stillness that followed, Andrew sensed the magnitude of the event. The pulse of alignment persisted quietly, a blueprint invisible to the untrained eye, accessible only to those willing to move beyond the confines of literal interpretation, to witness not a body rising, but the persistence of a consciousness operating fully aligned amidst the turbulence of human choice. Andrew felt the weight of history pressing down in ways the written record could never convey. The message that had been transmitted in resonance, the instructions embedded in consciousness, was immediately at risk of distortion. Those first followers, still processing the intensity of the energetic transmission, sought certainty, narrative, and structure. What was subtle, fluid, and alive in frequency became frozen into words and images, vulnerable to interpretation and misinterpretation alike. Institutions arose not simply to preserve knowledge, but to contain it, to codify it into forms that could be controlled, repeated, and enforced. The rewriting began almost instinctively. Andrew sensed that fear played a role. Not fear of Jesus, but fear of ambiguity. Human consciousness recoils from the unknown, from subtle instruction that demands personal engagement rather than obedience. Stories were solidified into doctrine, teachings compressed into commandments, and parables abstracted into moral lessons. The resonance of love, coherence, and awareness that had been demonstrated became subordinated to symbols, rituals, and hierarchies that insulated human authority. Andrew perceived a quiet irony. The very act of attempting to preserve truth had created an energetic barrier between the message and the world it had been intended to influence. Power amplified the distortion. Early institutions recognized that clarity of the original message threatened established social structures, challenged assumptions about morality, and exposed collective tendencies toward fear, judgment, and separation. Andrew felt the subtle currents of control weaving into the reinterpretation. What had been a template for consciousness became a narrative of obedience and fear of consequence. The vibrant, living instruction embedded in energetic coherence was repackaged into codified laws, ceremonial observances, and promises of reward or punishment, shifting focus from the internal cultivation of presence to external conformity. Over decades, centuries, and millennia, each retelling layered further interpretation upon interpretation. Andrew sensed how human patterning sought to fill gaps with certainty, to eliminate the ambiguity that was essential to the original teaching. Energetic instructions became doctrinal statements. Living resonance became historical anecdote, and subtle guidance on maintaining coherence under collapse became stories of suffering, redemption, and ritualized sacrifice. The field of potential influence contracted, while control expanded. The frequency of the original transmission remained, but it became hidden beneath layers of interpretation, accessible only to those attuned to the subtleties that had never been written down. Andrew realized that the process was not entirely malicious, but inevitable given the nature of human perception. The subtlety of consciousness-based instruction was beyond ordinary comprehension, and the institutions that rewrote it acted from survival instinct, from the need to stabilize the collective and maintain cohesion. Yet in doing so, they buried the original resonance beneath centuries of ritual, hierarchy, and projection. What Recknor had observed, what Jesus had transmitted, remained potent but dormant, awaiting those capable of sensing beyond narrative, beyond doctrine, and reconnecting with the original pulse of truth. History had rewritten the message, but Andrew understood that distortion did not erase it. Beneath every ritual, every text, and every story, the original energetic instruction continued to ripple quietly, imperceptible yet enduring, waiting for those with the sensitivity and courage to perceive it and allow it to awaken once more. The teaching that had been delivered in the resonance of presence was deceptively simple, yet infinitely profound. Andrew felt the subtle pulse of it as if it were a living current moving beneath the surface of the world, unnoticed yet persistent. It was not a doctrine, a creed, or a system of moral rules. It was an instruction encoded in the architecture of consciousness itself, a template for sustaining alignment, coherence, and love in a world dominated by fear, projection, and separation. Humanity had been offered a path not to perform acts of devotion, but to cultivate a state of being that could survive even when the collective turned away from integrity. Love, as transmitted through the resonance of Jesus's presence, was not a fleeting emotion or a conditional response. It was a frequency, measurable in its effects, even if invisible to the untrained eye. Andrew understood that the human heart generated a field of influence far beyond the physical body. And when attuned to coherence, it naturally radiated balance, compassion, and clarity to those nearby. This state was not dependent on approval, belief, or recognition. It existed independently, untouched by judgment or circumstance, and could be maintained even amid chaos, violence, or betrayal. Humanity had been given the tools to inhabit that field intentionally, to stabilize consciousness when external conditions threatened collapse, yet the teaching had been obscured. Andrew sensed how early interpreters had translated a living resonance into rituals, parables, and commandments, losing the experiential core in the process. What was meant to be directly known through practice, attention, and alignment became codified, debated, and externalized. The subtlety of the message, love as a state, a condition of being, a frequency that could be cultivated and sustained, was nearly invisible beneath layers of interpretation. Humanity had access to the truth, yet most lacked the sensitivity, patience, and discipline to perceive it directly. The instruction contained a profound paradox. It required surrender not to another, but to the internal mechanism of presence itself. Love could not be forced, commanded, or coerced. Attempting to impose it through obligation or moral compulsion only generated resistance, tension, and eventual collapse. Andrew sensed that the teaching's true power lay in its universality. It was available to any human willing to attune to their own heart, to cultivate coherence within themselves before attempting to project it outward. It was a blueprint for endurance, clarity, and resilience, a way to remain uncorrupted while the collective consciousness faltered. Andrew realized that this message had been the original purpose of every word, every demonstration, every moment of alignment that Jesus maintained. It was meant to be experienced, internalized, and radiated, not debated or written into doctrine. Humanity had been offered not salvation in the conventional sense, but a living frequency that could persist despite collapse, fear, and separation. It was simple yet radical, invisible yet transformative, waiting silently for those able to perceive it and embody it fully, in defiance of the world's misinterpretations and distortions. The essence of the teaching was clear to Andrew in the quiet resonance that lingered after the story had been observed. Love was not something to seek outside oneself, but a state to cultivate within, a frequency to sustain and radiate. This was the instruction that had been lost, distorted, and buried beneath centuries of interpretation, yet remained present, waiting for those willing to awaken to it. Andrew felt a chill as the connection between past and present became undeniable. The resonance that had unfolded in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago was not confined to history. It pulsed through the collective consciousness, even now. Humanity had not evolved beyond the tendencies observed in those final days. Fear, judgment, and disconnection had only intensified, layered with complexity, technology, and mass communication. But fundamentally, the pattern remained. The collapse that Jesus had silently witnessed, the deterioration of the capacity to love, to connect, to perceive clearly, was not a relic. It was ongoing, and its effects were measurable, subtle yet profound, infiltrating thought, behavior, and the very rhythm of human interaction. Emotional numbness was the signature of this collapse. Andrew sensed it in the way people moved through the world, distracted by obligation, habit, and a constant stream of external stimuli that diluted attention and coherence. Connection had become transactional, empathy conditional, and genuine presence rare. The teachings transmitted through resonance, through example, through subtle alignment, had been buried beneath layers of ritual, doctrine, and abstraction. Humanity had access to the frequency of love that could stabilize and elevate consciousness. But most could not perceive it because the collective field had been distorted, dampened, and polluted by fear and judgment. The urgency became clear. Moments like those observed in Jerusalem were not isolated events but archetypes, templates for understanding collective behavior when spiritual inertia took hold. Andrew realized that every expression of cruelty, every act of indifference, every inability to feel deeply, mirrored the patterns that had catalyzed the crucifixion. When fear dominates over love, when judgment replaces compassion, the spiritual infrastructure of society collapses quietly, invisibly, leaving a void that can only be sensed by those attuned to the subtleties of consciousness. Time was not a linear barrier. The energetic structures that had been demonstrated and observed remained accessible. The frequency that Jesus had radiated, that had been embedded in living memory, could still be reactivated. The challenge was the overwhelming volume of distortion that had accumulated over centuries. The internalized patterns of separation, the habituated distrust, and the normalization of emotional suppression. Andrew sensed that the moment was critical. Awareness alone was insufficient. Action, in the form of alignment, attention, and intentional cultivation of coherence, was required. The relevance was unmistakable. The internal collapse that had been present in Jerusalem now echoed globally. Humanity faced not just social, political, or environmental crises, but a spiritual and emotional degradation that threatened capacity for empathy, collaboration, and self-realization. Those capable of perceiving the subtle frequency, those willing to practice presence, to cultivate love as a state rather than an ideal, could begin to stabilize the field, creating ripples that might influence the broader collective. Andrew understood the invisible yet tangible stakes. History's silent witness was not merely a story. It was a guide, a map, and a warning. And the time to reconnect with the original instruction was now. For the collapse, though centuries in the making, could be interrupted if consciousness chose love over fear before the patterns hardened completely. The air in Andrew's perception shifted as the final resonance of understanding settled around him. Reknor did not speak in the conventional sense. Its communication was a flow of insight, a transmission of pattern and clarity that bypassed the limitations of language. The urgency in its presence was palpable, not as threat, but as insistence. An insistence that the truth, long dormant, must finally be acknowledged. Humanity's trajectory had always been a landscape of choice, layered in fear and love, separation and connection. And the collapse observed in Jerusalem had only been the first ripple of a cycle, repeating silently across millennia. Andrew sensed why the disclosure had waited until now. The world, saturated with technology, information, and distraction, had reached a point where the subtle frequencies of resonance could no longer be ignored. Individuals could feel the collective shift, the heaviness, the emotional numbness, yet most could not articulate it, nor recognize its origin. Reknor's silence had been strategic. Interference, even subtle, would have been misinterpreted, rejected, or feared. Observation allowed for accumulation, the precise mapping of patterns that could only be comprehended when the collective reached a certain sensitivity. Now, Andrew's awareness was sufficient to receive the message fully, to perceive the invisible architecture of influence, love, and choice that had been present all along. The choices before humanity were as stark as they were invisible. Continuation of separation and fear would deepen collapse, creating layers of internal and collective entropy that would take centuries to recover from, if at all. Yet the alternative was always present, a conscious return to coherence, the cultivation of love as a frequency rather than a belief, the disciplined alignment of thought, emotion, and presence. These were not theoretical suggestions. They were practical mechanisms for survival of the human essence itself. Andrew realized that what had been lost was never beyond recovery. It had been concealed, distorted, and diluted. The timing of revelation mattered, because awareness alone was insufficient without capacity for integration and practice. Reknor transmitted the final understanding. Observation is not passive. To witness is to map the possibilities, to perceive the consequences of choice, and to recognize the invisible strings that bind humanity together. The crucifixion, the silence of the disciples, the reactions of the crowds, the distortions that followed, all were symptoms of a species at a crossroads, and the echoes of that crossroads persisted. Andrew felt the weight of the responsibility placed upon those who could perceive the pattern. Conscious engagement, intentional cultivation of the loving frequency, and protection of one's inner coherence were the only tools to begin reversing the silent decay that had permeated history. The choice was not abstract. It was immediate, ongoing, and cumulative. Humanity could continue to fragment, to externalize blame, to allow fear and judgment to dominate, or it could remember, practice, and radiate the frequency that had been modeled, observed, and preserved, however faintly, across centuries. Andrew sensed the quiet insistence behind the transmission. The opportunity to alter the trajectory still existed, but only for those who dared to act within the invisible field. The silence had ended. The message was complete. The choice was now, and the window of possibility would not remain open indefinitely. The observer receded, leaving Andrew with the gravity of clarity, a still point in the storm, a map of consciousness, and the undeniable knowledge that what happens next depends upon whether humanity dares to remember what it was always meant to be.